Welcome to the second lecture in my series of graphic icons of the 20th century. I'm Howard Smith and was born during the Second World War, educated in Scotland and gained an MA from Trinity College Dublin before working in national and international advertising agencies on blue chip accounts. In the early 1980s I set up my own graphic studio and print works in Canterbury till my retirement in 2014. I then became an accredited lecturer for the Art Society, and my lectures are based on clients I have worked for and for lifelong interests. My graphic icon today is Rupert, the anthropomorphic bear. Now, I know many of you have problems with the word anthropomorphic, so here is an easy way to remember it. Anthropomorphic. It means an animal having human characteristics. Rupert fans, on the other hand, are zoomorphic. People acting like animals. Anyway, Rupert is 100 years old this November.
Happy birthday!
He's 6 years older than Winnie the Pooh, 8 years older than Mickey Mouse, and 40 years older than that other anthropomorphic bear. At nearly 100, Rupert is of the age at last to want to discover about his past. He shows Pong Ping his creator, Mary Caldwell, who originally in Canterbury did well. On the 28th of January 1874, Mary Caldwell was born in Canterbury, where her father, Samuel, worked at the cathedral as a stained glass artist and stonemason. Her mother, Sarah, had 13 children, of whom 4 boys and 4 girls survived. Mary attended the local school, where she was described as a shy and dreamy child, but her drawing ability was quickly recognised. In this photograph from the mid-1890s, Mary is on the right. Next to her is her younger brother Samuel, who is responsible for saving the cathedral's stained glass from the Blitz in World War II. Next is her father, Samuel Sr., who is originally a hairdresser. Just look at his beard. Then her elder brother Edmund, who was an artist, and his animal paintings are on permanent display in Cape Town, where he is recognised as one of South Africa's finest animal artists. We know him for his book illustrations of Jock of the Bushveld by Sir Percy Fitzpatrick. Mary followed Edmund in training at the Sidney Cooper School of Art in Canterbury. Thomas Sidney Cooper was a renowned animal artist who specialised in sheep and cows, small cows, medium-sized cows, and thumping big cows. One wonders whose picture this replaced on the baronial staircase. Here is a contemporary photograph of the studio. It shows how Mary gains a rather classical training. Mary is almost certainly one of the ladies in the picture. If you have any idea which one, answers on a postcard, please. Also, in 1874, at St Peter Port, Guernsey, Herbert Bird Tortel was born 3 weeks earlier on the 7th of January. His father, Peter, was a struggling tailor, and had been helped by his cousin, the Reverend Robert Henry Tortel, to rent the decommissioned rectory house, which had a shop on the ground floor. Herbert, whose name means the bright one, went to the intermediate school. Incidentally, Tortel means the deformed one, which is probably the reason why we've never found any photograph of him at all. I've been searching for over 20 years. Anyway, the Reverend Tortel recognised how bright Herbert was and helped him gain a scholarship to the Elizabeth College in 1887. Here you can see it overlooking the harbour, the most prestigious school in the Channel Islands. Here he became president of the Debating Society and also the first editor of the school magazine. Among his many interests, Herbert was fascinated by the tales of the brothers Grimm. These were not the nice ones we now know, but the cautionary tales, where Hansel and Gretel were killed and eaten at the gingerbread house by a wicked witch. Thoroughly grim. He was also influenced by the extremely strong mythology and folklore of the island. Still to this day in the West is the Plainmont fairy ring and caves where fairies, goblins and little people allegedly live. A book which certainly interested him was Guernsey Folklore by the Bailiff of Guernsey, Edgar McCulloch, 800 pages long with tales of witchcraft, fairies, castles, black magic, all to appear in later Rupert stories. In 1891 he left school and went to work in the struggling draper shop. Here it is on the right of the picture with the red striped awning. His father needed all the help he could get. By now his mother was blind and not well. She in fact died in 1892. He was dreadfully bored and whiled his time away by writing poetry. He soon had quite a portfolio and remembered that the father of one of his classmates was a printer, Frederick Blondel Goering, and in 1895 he persuaded him to publish a book of his poems. Herbert wrote The Coming of Ragnarok at the age of 18. The main poem is about the war of the gods and how in Ragnarok they set about destroying themselves and the world. This is the inspiration for Wagner's Ring, Götterdämmerung, heavy stuff, and it gained him the sobriquet of being a minor British poet. It also had tributes to his hero Tennyson, who visited the island and later died. Then, as a tribute, or so I thought, to the Reverend Robert Henry Tortel, there were a number of religious verses. Emmanuel, the Christian watchword, a Christian battle song. I thought these were a thanks for all the help he had given him, but no, Herbert was after something else. The religious verses were there to persuade the Reverend Tortel to help him get a place at Trinity College, Cambridge, reading divinity. The Reverend had told Herbert how he had gone to Trinity College, Dublin, getting a scholarship and also a sizer, which was subsidised lodgings and food. Herbert found out that Cambridge operated the same system, and that Trinity College was where his beloved romantic poets, Tennyson, Byron, etc. had gone, and he persuaded the Reverend Tortel to help him get there. The only records I have found were for the sizer and for an award which was a poetry prize by the Vice-Chancellor, and also this entry in the admissions, where at the end you'll see he matriculated in 1895 and did not graduate. I believe the reason he didn't graduate is because he didn't want to become a vicar. By now, Herbert's father was declared bankrupt, so there was no reason to return to Guernsey, so he went straight to London and got lodgings at Pinner with a Walter Meakin. He sought out the London distributors of his Guernsey book, and at the bottom you'll see Simpkin, Marshall, Hamilton, Kent & Co. He met up with Lord Hamilton, a Conservative peer, and showed him his vast portfolio of poetry. Hamilton looked at it and said, yeah, jolly good, old chap. Yeah, no, very good indeed. But actually, poetry these days does need to have some illustrations with them. It makes it a lot more saleable. Go away and get them illustrated, and when you've done so, do come back to me. Herbert was in a quandary as he had no money, but he hit upon an idea. He goes to the Royal College of Art in South Kensington and persuades one of the tutors to get a student to illustrate his poems. Free of charge, of course. They agree to do so, and 6 weeks later he receives a letter saying they have some proposals, and there meets Mary Caldwell, who had gained a place from Canterbury to go to the college. Now, we have Herbert's diary, which recounts their first meeting. November the 9th. Saw Miss Caldwell at South Kensington. She is the most beautiful girl, a daughter of the gods, divinely tall and most divinely fair. A quote from Tennyson. Her illustrations to my poems are simply splendid. Herbert falls hopelessly in love with her. His diary and poems were found in Australia in 1995 and bought by Canterbury City Museums. Herbert had entrusted them to Mary's other brother George, who had immigrated to Melbourne to become a father and had died there in 1928. The diary covers 3 years, from 1898 to 1900, and recounts in detail the number of times that Herbert and Mary got engaged and the number of times they got disengaged. I like her very much. She is one of the most frank, interesting, candid girls I have ever met. And what is more, unlike so many of these clever girls, she is distinctly handsome. Herbert was besotted by her, and Mary was extremely confused by the attention. The diary is a simple quarto-line book and records sometimes daily events, thoughts and liaisons with Mary. She lived with her brother in Harrow, which was convenient as she didn't need a chaperone. Herbert records how one time Mary returned to Canterbury to see her parents and how he followed her there. He stayed outside Canterbury and met up with her on a daily basis in secret, with Mary leaving to see him under the pretext of going sketching. Here is one of the sketches, and here is a diary entry. I stayed for a week in Canterbury and there saw Portia. Portia was Herbert's nickname for Mary, daughter of the gods. Tennyson. I saw Portia every day. We had to be careful, for we do not desire the fact of our engagement to become vulgar property just at the present. It is time enough for others to know about it when we are married. Poor Herbert was broke, and it wasn't possible to get married in those days if you had no prospects or no money. In early 1900, things started to look up. He gets a job with the Sunday Sun. Now, I haven't been able to find anything about the Sunday Sun except for these 3 advertisements, where it's an ideal literary paper, and there we have a review of King Arthur and his Knights by Herbert Tortel, Concerning Byron by Herbert Tortel, Tennyson and Kipling by Herbert Tortel. Within 6 months, he has become deputy editor of a newspaper. He then leaves the Sunday Sun and joins the Daily Express, which had been founded that year in April. He joins as a farm reporter, and, because he gets more wherewithal, he proposes again, probably about the 5th time, to Mary, and she accepts. Mary could have got married at Canterbury Cathedral because her father worked there. But no, Herbert chose St Giles in Stoke Poges, which is where Thomas Gray wrote his elegy written in a country churchyard. So on the 26th of September 1900, Mary and Herbert got married. Herbert's best man was Walter Meakin, his landlord, and Mary was given away by her younger brother Samuel. They then went to live in Pinner with Walter Meakin. At that time, the tax on paper was reduced. This meant a resurgence in books, and Mary, wanting to continue with a life of freelance design, took great advantage of this. One of the first contracts that Mary got was to produce 2 books. They were only tiny, about 4 inches tall. One was called a horse book and the other 3 foxes, and they were for a publisher, Grant Richards, who had rejected Herbert's poetry so many times. But it was clear even at this stage that Herbert was quite interested and involved with Mary's freelance work. The horse book, produced in 1901, was an exploration of all the roles that horses played in our current lives. It was brilliant and anatomically correct from any angle. Her illustrations were absolutely splendid. Thomas Sidney Cooper had made all his students visit the local abattoir to study muscle structure, and that is why these were so anatomically correct. And it also probably explained why Mary was a vegetarian, much to Herbert's disgust. Each illustration was accompanied by a poem. What sweeter sound on winter morn than music of the hounds and horn? These were written by Herbert. Now, isn't it ironical that Herbert had hired Mary initially to illustrate his poems, and here was Mary getting Herbert to write poetry for her illustrations? The second book, The 3 Little Foxes, came out in 1903. And for the next 10 years, Mary did illustrations for many books, like this little one for the Humpty Dumpty book. 6 sets of 6 postcards, delightful simple illustrations. This is a stump book, a long thin book about 8 inches long, which contained, I suppose you call them panorama illustrations. This book, from 1910, was only 3 inches tall. The Diverting History of John Gilpin. It was 140 pages and had 30 illustrations by Mary Tortel. But the intriguing part was the cover, which in fact was a matchbox. Now, it was not de rigueur for ladies in those days to read books, so while they were waiting for a 4-in-hand, say, a lady could read a book like this. When it came along, snap it shut and put it into her clutch bag, and nobody would ever know that she was reading. Meanwhile, Herbert was doing very well for himself. He was promoted to become night editor at the Daily Express, and they moved into apartments here in Earl's Court Square. They also had one of the modern inventions, a telephone, so that Herbert... Sorry, did I wake you? So that Herbert could be called in at any time of the night to change a story. They had no children, and we don't know the reason why. But they compensated for this by travelling all over the place. They travelled to India, Egypt, and Italy. From Venice to Pisa, they followed the trails of the Romantic poets. With the Great War, Herbert found himself running the paper as deputy editor. Sometimes it was only 4 pages long. During the war he'd become fascinated by flying, and afterwards wrote under the name of Icarus on promoting air travel. It was in 1919 that an envelope dropped on his desk at the Express. In it were 2 tickets for the inaugural flight from London to Brussels. He took Mary. It was in a converted World War I Handley Page bomber. There were 6 seats in the cabin and the pilot sat outside. A small ladder gave you access to the cabin. And here they are checking the budget airline insurance. The previous London to Paris inaugural flight had to stop 12 times on the way to the Channel because of technical problems. This was Herbert and Mary's Wind of the Willows moment, in which Toad had been run over by a car. "Beep, beep," he said. "Beep, beep." Toad became obsessed with cars. And similarly, Herbert and Mary became obsessed by air travel and flew everywhere. Later on that year, he came back to Earth with a bump. He was called before Lord Beaverbrook, who asked him, "Why is the Daily Express 1/3 the circulation that of the Daily Mail?" Herbert didn't know and said he'd go and investigate. The only major difference he found was that the Mail had an anthropomorphic mouse called Teddy Tail, which first appeared in 1915. The Mirror followed in 1919 with Pip, Squeak and later Wilfred. These were the affectionate names given to the World War I campaign medals. Both were probably influenced by Louis Wayne's illustrations of highly social cats and dogs. At that time, there were 169 fairs travelling around England, which featured the late Victorian and Edwardian fascination for anything unusual, like twin-headed babies, bearded ladies, and also bears from Eastern Europe, who could stand on their hind feet and gyrate to the beat of a drum, so-called dancing bears. These bears would be marched through the suburbs to advertise the forthcoming fairs. In Germany, in 1902, Margarita Steiff started to make her famous bears with the red tag in their ears. And in America, Theodore Roosevelt dropped the moose as his campaign mascot and adopted a bear. And it was called, yes, absolutely right, a teddy bear, thank you. Also in 1919, Mary had got a contract from Sefton Fabrics in Belfast to produce a set of printed handkerchiefs, When Animals Work. Rupert fans will immediately recognise Edward Trunk, the foxes and the rabbits, and inside are 2 pages showing what we believe to be the first sightings of Rupert with Mummy Bear. Herbert saw Beaverbrook and said the paper needed an anthropomorphic bear like Teddy Tail. And what is more, my wife can do it. Mary admitted later he hadn't even asked her. So at the age of 46, on the 8th of November 1920, Mary drew her first Rupert frame, Little Lost Bear. Mrs. Bear sends her little son Rupert to market. The most popular Christian name at that time was Rupert, and guess what? It was to do with poetry and the popularity of Rupert Brooke. 2 jolly bears once lived in a wood. Their little son lived there too. One day his mother sent him off the marketing to do. This was written by Herbert. He was of French extraction, so English was not his first language. She wanted honey, fruits and eggs. So go off to the market, get them, she said, and come straight back and don't dilly-dally on the way. On the way back, Rupert was held up at gunpoint by the 2 foxes, and all the provisions stolen. Just look at that lumpy bear in these early days. Rupert was disorientated and walked off and found a rip-off, really, by Herbert, of the Sugar Plum House from Grimm's Fairy Tales. Come and eat me, it said, so he climbed up on the roof, and as he did so, a wolf came flying out the door to get at him, and at the same time a hook comes out of the sky, grabs him by the jersey and pulls him up to the only joke that Mary ever had, which was a flying boat. And there Rupert directs the pilot to go back to his home in Nutwood. This story was absolutely loved by children and set the pattern for future children's stories. Rupert leaves home, has an adventure, comes home. Enid Blyton was the same with her famous 5, leaving home, having an adventure on Cairn Island and coming home. Rushmore Crompton's William leaves home, causes chaos with the outlaws and slinks back home. And so the stories started to appear in the Express. After they had appeared in the paper, they were compiled into these little yellow books produced by Sampson Low. Here's the selection. Look at the picture on the left. Death was never a problem for children in those days, and neither was witchcraft in the middle. Here's a familiar one, Rupert and Bill's Aeroplane Adventure. The plane illustrated is identical to the one that Mary had flown in with Herbert on the London-Brussels inaugural flight. It had 6 cane seats in the passenger compartment. Rupert and Bill are looking out of the window. How excited were they when they saw Rupert's cottage down below. And in the garden Mummy Bear, how little did she know. This was the start of Rupert flying everywhere, on the back of a gander, in a biplane, or being chased by dragons on the back of a horse, or even on a witch's broomstick. Let's have a detailed look at one of the stories, Rupert, the Mannequin and the Black Knight. Rupert is walking outside a wood when suddenly he hears a commotion and rushes in and finds a small man being pulled by a fish into a pond by his beard. Rupert rescues him, and the little man, the mannequin, shakes himself down and says,
"If there's anything I can do to help, just let me know,"
and wanders off. Rupert then meets up with his 2 friends, the foxes, and as they walk they see an exotic bird flying into the woods. They follow it and eventually come to a tree with a nest in it. As Rupert climbs a tree to examine the nest, a black knight appears from nowhere and grabs Rupert by the collar. He takes him off to a woodchopper's house and says to the man, "Here's another one, get rid of him like you got rid of the rest," and leaves. The woodchopper looks at Rupert and says, "Now you go out the back door and go home straight away and don't stop on the way." Rupert comes across a young girl sobbing her heart out. He talks to her and finds out that she is a princess and has been put under a spell by a wicked witch to look after pigs for the rest of her life. And only somebody brave like Rupert could save her. Rupert rises to the occasion and goes off to find the witch, who captures him and puts him in a dungeon where Rupert explains why he is there, and the witch says, "Well, if you can feed my horse tomorrow, I might let you go." On the way to feed the horse, Rupert comes across the little mannequin and tells him he's going to feed the witch's horse. The mannequin exclaims,
"He'll kill you, he's feral."
"What can I do?" says Rupert. The mannequin replies,
Well, you could try Remember You Moraldimont.
I have to interject here because I can't find anything about Moraldimont. But Moraldi was a guillotine-wielding witch, and Monty means from the mountains, who was known at the time and was fearsome. Rupert gets to the stable and goes to feed the horse, who starts to go for Rupert, who cries, "Remember You Moraldimont." The horse stops and takes his hay. At that moment the witch comes and is horrified that Rupert is still alive. It's a trick, she cries. "You promised to let me go," says Rupert. "Well, I might do," says the witch, "if you go and collect 2 sacks from my tough top." The next day, Rupert takes a horse and goes to Tough Top, who turns out to be an ogre. Just look at the terrified horse. Rupert wakes the ogre, who then comes menacingly at him. Quickly, Rupert shouts, "Remember You Moraldimont." The ogre then gives him 2 sacks of gold, which Rupert then takes back to the witch. Again, she's horrified. "You said you'd let us go," said Rupert. The witch acquiesces and says, "I will let you go tomorrow if you tell me what my name is," and she goes off cackling to her room, followed by the cat, who listens to her dancing around. "No, you'll never guess what my name is. You'll never guess it's Trolldrudess." The cat reports back to Rupert, who the next morning tells the witch her name, Trolldrudess. The dungeon door flies open and the witch falls to her death. Her stick flies in the air and hits Rupert, knocking him out. When he comes to, he's in the arms of a beautiful princess with the little man looking very smug beside her, and the Black Knight who takes Rupert home. Here's a story, Rupert in Dreamland. Rupert is sitting reading a book of nursery rhymes and falls to sleep. In his dream along comes a gander and asks him if he would like to go to Dreamland. "Hop on my back," she says, "and off we'll go." They land on a beach. There was old Mother Hubbard and her dog, Humpty Dumpty, all alone, and little Bo Peep without her sheep, wondering where they had gone. Now, the traced illustration on the left completely matches the final version on the right, so Mary had obviously drawn this, and the words on the left were written by Herbert. As you can see in the centre, he spells Humpty Dumpty wrongly, something Mary would never have done. The story also contains Old King Cole's Party, which was a complete copy of the Alice in Wonderland Mad Hatter's Tea Party. The story ends on frame 59, when Rupert stirs and falls off the chair and wakes up again. Again, a Rupert story with familiar characters. Remember Mary's early sketch when they were courting? Well, 25 years later, the same sketch appears in a book, Rupert and Algy at Hawthorne Farm. Notice the similarity of the pictures. Stories were reprinted in the Little Bear Adventure series, with some innovative pop-ups. In the top right-hand corner, Rupert is wearing a blue jumper. This is how Mary originally drew him. It was later that Rupert swapped to Bill Badger's clothes, which were more distinctive with the red jumper and the yellow check trousers and scarf. Mary's artwork is extremely rare, as it was mostly lost, being passed round many printers for reprints. It was very clean and simple and precise, and you can see here in these surviving boards. It's quite amazing how few lines she used to communicate the story. Unfortunately, reproduction in the paper tended to lose this precision. The blue crayon is an instruction to the printers to add a tint or a colour tint, which was usually red. 1930, disaster. Herbert develops phthisis, the white man's plague, which we know as tuberculosis. Herbert goes to Germany, to the sanatorium Grödel, where the world's leading respiratory doctors practiced. They recommend he leaves London because of the smog and traffic fumes, and also cuts out the cigars. He and Mary go to Florence, and still continue to produce Rupert, but he doesn't recover, and returns to Germany, where on the 6th of June 1931 he dies, aged 57. He leaves £602, which shows really how much he spent on travelling. Mary had his body repatriated and cremated at Golders Green Crematorium. Mary was completely devastated and returned to Canterbury to live with her younger brother, Samuel. For the rest of her life, she was an austere character with black dresses and a pearl necklace. She carried Herbert's ashes everywhere she travelled. She continued with Rupert for another 3 years, but resigned in 1935, fearing eyesight problems. In all, she had illustrated some 88 stories. In the Blitz, she evacuated to Mostyn's Hotel in Llandudno Wells, which she had visited with Herbert many times previously. In 1948, back in Canterbury, she collapsed with a massive brain tumour and died aged 74 on the 15th of March 1948. She was reunited with Herbert, when she was buried with his ashes at St Martin's in Canterbury. In 1935, when Mary retired, Stanley Marshall, who was known as Uncle Bill, the children's editor, set about looking for a replacement and found Alfred Bestall, who he appointed to take over as the second official Rupert artist. Bestall and Mary never met, and the only instruction that Stanley gave to Alfred was, "There must be no bad characters, no magic, and no fairies." Bestall was born in Mandalay in 1892 to Methodist missionary parents. He studied at the London Central School of Art and then went on to contribute to Punch. He also illustrated over 100 books, including some by A. A. Milne and Enid Blyton. His first strip for Rupert was in June 1935, Rupert, Algy and the Smugglers. Bestall decided to continue in the same style as Mary, but put more expression into Rupert's face, as you can see here. Again, with very, very few lines. The annual started at the same time as Bestall, and the illustrations that were in the paper were coloured by Doris Campbell, which completely transformed the stories into what we now know so well. Here's a lovely example of some very subtle colouring. Bestall introduced a lot of science into his strips. Just look at Rupert's face as the professor pushes the button to bring down a breakfast of eggs, toast and steaming coffee. And here is Rupert being completely anthropomorphic, as a small boy, getting excited every time he sees an aeroplane. Bestall introduced a lot more dynamism in the illustrations. He brought in 3D rather than the flatter 2D, different sized frames and cliffhangers. For example, here on day 1, Rupert and Algy are trying out a new soapbox, and in the second frame it's flying through the air. What's going to happen next? This is a cliffhanger. Day 2. Crash! Straight into the undergrowth. But Algy has seen something. What is he saying? Yes, it's another cliffhanger. Bestall both wrote and drew the strip, and this ending of a cliffhanger each day was extraordinarily creative. Also creative is the way he starts an adventure. Here on the left, Rupert comes across a gate in a field. He tries to go round it and is mysteriously blocked. The only way is to go through it. Then the adventure begins. On the right-hand side, Rupert goes to post a letter and sees tracks in the snow. He follows them. Where are they going? Cliffhanger. He follows them to a tree. We know what is going to happen next. Cliffhanger. Very clever. Rupert's love of flying continues with this remarkable strip of a fixed-wing helicopter, a Rotodyne, 12 years before it was actually made. Here's a great bit of creativity and ingenuity. Rupert and Algy have climbed to the top of a tower, and the door shuts behind them. There's no way to open it from outside, and he can't throw the key down to Bill, who is downstairs, because it might get lost in the long grass. So he finds a sheet of paper and makes an aeroplane. He attaches the key to it and flies it down to Bill, who opens the door and rescues them. The origami plan planes were included in the annual by Bestall and became a regular feature with other objects like boats and elephants. Bestall went on to become the chairman of the British Origami Society. Most of Bestall's stories were written for adults. For example, this one, Rupert and the Mare's Nest. usually about an idea or something that doesn't exist. Parents would enjoy reading the stories and chuckle how their child interpreted it, both enjoying the experience of reading a story. So Rupert had been reading a book in which there is a tale of a mare's nest. He shows it to his father, who looks at it and says, "Oh, no, no, it's a joke." "No, it's not," says Rupert. "It's in the book, here." "No, no, 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 it's an illusion. It doesn't exist." "It does," says Rupert. "Look, it's in the book. Here, look, here." Exasperated, his father says, "Oh, okay, Rupert. Look, if you can find a mare's nest, I'll treat you to a 2-week holiday at the seaside." That was enough. Rupert was off. He walked through the woods and found a castle, spoke to the king about his quest, and the king replied, "Yes, there's a hill to the south of here with, I think, a nest on top of it." Rupert goes off to investigate, and when he finds the nest, a mare's head pops up. Rupert explains to her why he's there. She kills herself with laughter and says, "Here, hop on my back, I'll take you home." On the way, Rupert says, "Well, how am I going to tell my father that you exist?" "Oh, no problem," she says. "Come to the pond just outside your village tonight, and I will prove that I exist." So that night, Rupert gets his father to go out to the pond, and there, in one of the trees, was a huge nest, and from it the mare rises up out of it and spreads her wings. Just look at the body language of amazement in Rupert's father. Bestall was very keen on silent movies, and you can see this from the illustration. Anyway, the next day Rupert's father goes to the railway station and books tickets for a 2-week holiday at the seaside. Other titles that had adult jokes were Rupert and the Blue Moon, The Early Bird, The Backroom Boy, Rupert and the Flying Boat. While Mary was still alive, Bestall never signed his work, but used devices like putting his initials on a car registration plate, or in this case, on a suitcase at the bottom. During World War II, Beaverbrook, the proprietor of the Express, was in charge of munitions and supply, and ensured that the annual came out regularly, even though it was in paper covers. He argued that the annual was a great morale booster. Bestall introduced these wonderful end papers for the annuals. Here, Rupert and his friends were there basically to extend stories, a scene overlooking an English landscape. Here they are, overlooking Wales. You can see the groups of characters all round the picture, and Rupert is flying at the helicopter we saw earlier. Bestall had a cottage here in Wales. And when the stories became more exotic, he had exotic end papers, like this one here, and Rupert is sitting underneath an umbrella on the middle of the right-hand side of the picture. Here's another lovely bit of creativity. Bestall's only ever topical story, which was of the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II. Ozzy, from Australia, had come over and suggested to Rupert that he took him to the coronation. Rupert is on his shoulders waving. As the Queen comes along, the crowds move forward and Rupert falls off. Ozzy is lost in the crowd, and Rupert ends up being pushed down the escalators. He escapes at the bottom and is wondering what to do when, psst, a little mouse shows him an open panel and lets Rupert through. He goes down a narrow tunnel, past whirring pieces of machinery. At the bottom, Rupert tells the mouse he wants to go home, but they've gone below the underground. "We've got to go lower still," says the mouse, "to the animal railway." Rupert looks quizzical. "How do you think animals get around?" says the mouse. "Follow me." After a while they come to Mr. Mole, who asks where he wants to go. "Nutwood, please," says Rupert. Mr. Mole checks his schedule and takes Rupert to a door marked Nutchester via Nutwood. "Here you are, lad. In you hop." Press the green button. The floor starts to move and eventually Rupert ends up in a cave marked Nutwood with a prominent exit sign. Rupert follows it and with a red lever opens a hatch which is in the middle of Nutwood High Street. Rupert climbs out. The hatch shuts. Bang! And Rupert swaggers off, happily knowing the true purpose of manhole covers. Bestall lived at Beckenham, and 3 girl guides locally found out who he was and asked him to include them in one of his Rupert stories. Bestall obliged. And so, Pauline Coates, Janet Frankson and Beryl Sweet, you were immortalised in not 1, but 18 stories overall. Over the years, it became a history of girl guide uniforms. In these express advertisements that appeared in the annuals, Rupert is portrayed as a little boy, having a sack race at school being watched by his parents. And what little boy wouldn't enjoy having a treehouse to play in with his friends? In 1973, Bestall drew the annual artwork shown on the left. It was a tradition started by Mary that Rupert should be brown-faced, but at the proof stage, an express director changed him to a white face without consulting Bestall, who was absolutely furious and resigned immediately. Over 40 years, Bestall had drawn 265 stories, or approximately 12,000 frames. And in 1950, the annual sold 1.7 million copies, and inevitably these were in Christmas stockings. And with it, you probably got one of these, if you were lucky.
How did you come to take on Rupert?
Ah, well, by that time I'd had 14 years, or 15 years in Fleet Street, and had pretty well got on, you see. The humorous ideas I seemed to get so often included children, and I found I had a facility for drawing children. I always had a delight in the beauty of children. I could draw them. And I'd found myself drawing children more and more.
You didn't really like Rupert then?
Not particularly. Well, I hadn't read the stories, but I wasn't too keen on Mary Total's own work. She was a highly classical artist, and as I said before, I thought her work was just a little flat-footed, but at that time I considered myself an all-round artist, and that if I was wanted, I could take it on. So I thought I would turn out 3 specimen drawings, and
what were the main differences that you introduced to Rupert? How did you change what Mary Total had done?
well, I wanted a bit more action and a lot more humor. I can't remember her introducing humor at all. She was an expert at creating suspense, but I had to have a certain amount of humor in it. And
how long does it take you to draw one Rupert picture?
well, I tried when I was in full work to do 3 pictures and the captions in one day. And people thought I drew a lot faster than that. But
how do you work? When you work, do you have the whole story in your mind before you start? Or
no, I often haven't any story. I base my story sometimes on just an unusual phrase, like the Gooseberry Fool.
What was the first story?
Rupert, Algy and the Smugglers.
Did you feel that you were being successful then in the early years of Rupert?
Well, I felt that my first story was all right. It was the first story I'd ever written for anybody, you see. And that certainly pleased me. I hadn't realized I was an author. And
I believe there was some point of disagreement over the cover of the 1973 annual. Could you...
There was a very strong disagreement.
What was it about?
Well, they put these items on Rupert. They took out the colour plain, and that's a heinous sin for anybody to do anything to an artist's original without his permission.
So it was because normally Rupert is a white bear inside, but
Inside,
he's
yes.
brown on the cover.
We've often had questions from children. How is it that he's brown on the cover and white inside? And he's brown on the cover largely because if Mary Torter ever did a cover, she made it brown.
But what you objected to was not the fact that you didn't like having a white Rupert on the cover, but that they'd interfered with your artwork after you'd done it.
Oh, absolutely.
Do you feel that dedicating your life to writing for children is a worthwhile thing?
I think so. If you have an idea what direction you want to lead them. Yes, I think I've been extremely fortunate.
Aren't we all in search of happiness?
The third official Rupert artist, John Harold, took over in 1976, and for the next 31 years drew Rupert. He was born in Glasgow in 1947 and studied at the School of Art in the classic Charles Rennie Mackintosh building. Harold's depths of drawing and subsequent drama gave a fresh impetus to the panels, but he still kept the nostalgia so loved by generations. His illustrations are incredibly precise, and the expressions that he managed to get for Rupert are just quite remarkable. Since 2007, the Express has been running reprints daily, so Rupert is now 100 years old. Let's have a look at the artist over the years and how their styles changed. Rupert does like to be beside the seaside. These are still very traditional 1930s images, with plenty of social distancing on the beaches. The train at the bottom is still a classic steam train. Some of you might remember the milk churns in the bottom left-hand corner of the early morning trains. Dragons under Mary were very, very classical. Under Bestall, they breathed fire and brimstone, but John Harold's always had a sore throat from so much flame. Rupert is captured by brigands, by foxes, and by burglars. PC Growler, after 50 years, gets promoted, and in the top right-hand corner has become a sergeant. And I love this frame by John Harold, following the trail. A cup of tea always sorts everything out. Finally, as Christmas is coming up, I'd like to return to Mary Tortel's original lion artwork and show you how good it was. We asked Gina Hart, who was a colourist on the Rupert annuals, to colour Mary's drawings. And I think the result says it all.